Mr. President, members of the Executive Board, colleagues and friends. Today is the first occasion on which I can address this august body that is so critical to setting the directions of UNDP, to hold it accountable, but also to be the custodian of an idea that began many years ago when the United Nations Development Programme was founded. It remains an extraordinarily dynamic, diverse and central organization to the United Nations system. And therefore, Mr. President, I also want to thank on this, the first occasion that I can address you, express my gratitude and appreciation for the trust and the confidence that both the Secretary General and you as member states have placed in me. We meet at a time of profound change, of extraordinary challenges and also opportunities. This may sound not new to you because in many respects the last few years have already signaled to us that we are in a profound era of transition, of transformation, one that is not least part of the daily news coverage that we receive from around the world, some terrifying, some very tragic, and others very exciting, and also with an outlook to the future that holds great promise. So this is not an age in which to be pessimistic, but it is an age in which to be concerned about our capacity to make those transitions, about our capacity to act collectively, and therefore by extension also our capacity as the United Nations system, and not least as the United Nations Development Programme, to play a central role in these processes of transformation and transition. The adoption of Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals represented a watershed moment, not only in terms of the United Nations, but also in terms of the global development agenda. We meet today 2 years into this process of implementation, and I must say to you, I am not only surprised, but also very excited by the progress that I have seen, that only a few weeks ago together we could witness here at the High-Level Political Forum, and that I have since also seen on trips to Asia, to Europe, and also in many discussions with those who are working in the business world, in the civil society world, on trying to take this complex agenda, because complex it is, of the 2030 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, and take them to where they really will make a difference, at national level, at sub-national level, with real people beginning to work with this framework that can be so profoundly transformative if taken as a way to frame development decisions and choices in the years to come. When I speak to the notion of transformation and transition, let me for a moment also reflect on why this era is so profoundly challenging to many countries, and why we are also fortunate to, for the first time in over 70 years, to have a development agenda that is no longer focused on only one part of the world, but recognizes that people, poor people, live in poor countries, but also in rich countries. That actions that affect the environment and our life support systems on this planet, taken in one part of the world, can have profoundly deep and far-reaching consequences in other parts of the world. To have a development agenda in the year 2017 that unifies an understanding of people and planet in our societies in the way that Agenda 2030 has succeeded in doing, through the leadership of member states in negotiating also the Sustainable Development Goals, is profound beyond just a moment in the history of the United Nations taking decisions. It echoes also the so-called megatrends, our increasing discomfort with recognizing that inequality and unsustainability have become forces in our societies at national level, regionally and globally, that threaten our capacity to develop. And it's as simple as that. And that is why development is so central to the discussion about what happens next. And that is also why the mandate of this organization, the United Nations Development Programme, is so central to what happens next within the context of what the United Nations family of institutions and of political bodies can offer to the world to allow us to act collectively, to allow us to act together on issues that increasingly we have come to realize cannot be solved by individual communities or by individual nations and governments, but indeed are premised on our capacity to act together. But it is not only poverty, inequality, and unsustainability. It is also the extraordinary numbers that also characterize, for instance, population dynamics, and not just in terms of absolute numbers of additional people on our planet, and the journey that we have taken over 300 years from 1 billion people to 7 billion and soon to 8, 9, and possibly 10. It is also, as my dear late colleague Babatunde always said, it's in the demographics, in the population dynamics that we need to understand the relevance of what is happening to our societies. Young people, those who are, in a sense, the most energetic and most aspirational in many parts of the world, are facing a bleak future at the most critical moment in their lives, when they step from their home, their families, and their education phase in life into the so-called economy, for which, for many of them, there will be very little room, very little to look forward to. It is also in the phenomena of aging that is defining increasingly the challenges of a solidarity compact in our societies. How will we look after an ever more aging population, when in fact those who are at the workplace are not able to sustain the funding, and never mind the health costs that are implied by these aging trends? These are not just peripheral developments. They are fundamentally affecting how our societies will function together and collectively in the future. Migration and urbanization, the spectacle of the last few years in which we have witnessed, first of all, a world that was unable to recognize how fundamentally central the United Nations humanitarian response capacity was to avoiding the kind of migration crisis and refugee crisis we have seen, by not being able to put up the financing that would have prevented us shutting health posts and schools and halving food rations at the most critical moment, for example, of the refugee crisis around Syria. And then seeing parts of the world struggle with what are, in terms of the future prospects, still relatively limited numbers of people who are forced to leave the place they call home. Alongside more structural trends of urbanization, unprecedented in human history, what will happen over the next few decades. And then environmental degradation and climate change. To say this after a week of looking across the world and seeing over 40 million people in South Asia affected by extraordinarily extreme rainfalls, and unfortunately more on the way, but also looking to Houston and looking to Switzerland and to Sierra Leone, how much more do we need to see before we realize that when we talk about acting on climate change and global warming and environmental change, we are not talking about the luxury of those who have made it in development. We're actually talking about protecting the fundamental opportunity to even think about development in the future. And another mega trend, technologies. We live in an age where automation, the digital economy, artificial intelligence are going to transform things we consider to be regular and normal activities today in just a few decades. The profound implications, positive and challenging and threatening to some, and sometimes to the benefit of some and at the expense of others, is going to be one of the central challenges in which we have to mediate development choices and decisions. And these are not topics that are, in the first instance, most relevant to the more developed nations, the wealthier nations. No, to a continent like Africa, thinking about the future of its people in terms of jobs and employment and livelihoods and industrialization, understanding the implications of technology choices, of artificial intelligence, of automation, is fundamental to the development pathways that will be chosen. And again, this cannot be something that countries have to resolve in isolation. We are talking about a global economy which can either carry 7, 8, 9 billion people in the course of development, or we are going to talk about a global economy and globalization falling apart over the very promises of the greatest breakthroughs in technology and science that the world has ever had at its disposal. So these are the megatrends that define the development choices of the years to come. And while I have focused in part on some of the more challenging ones and also where we see failures, in fact, we live in an extraordinary age of opportunity that if only we learn to not view globalization as only a process of outcompeting one another, but rather investing in one another's capacity and capabilities, we could actually have the best century in human history ahead of us. That, to me, is the backdrop against which a strategic plan, a strategy, and a mandate of the United Nations Development Programme as part of the United Nations Development System and as part of the overall mandate of the United Nations must be both understood, interpreted, and articulated. That is why, in the way that we proceed, we have taken Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals as the central reference point. And we also recognize that UNDP, and that is what we are putting to you, must evolve its offerings in a world that is looking for quality integrated policy advice and responses, multidimensional, cognizant of a systems perspective, and of an extraordinary variety and diversity of realities, national realities, that this organization must be responsive to. And that includes the way in which we will have to adapt also the approach of delivering as one. We have made significant progress in a number of countries, but the fundamental DNA of the United Nations is still one of having separate entities working alongside each other, seeking to cooperate, rather than envisaging the development promise of a UN support offer to being one of the most extraordinary packages of expertise and institutional capacity available anywhere in the world. If you take the UN development system with its over 30 agencies, funds, and programs, we should be the most extraordinary resource to countries available from any source in terms of advice, financing, and support. And yet, as you have repeatedly found, and also the Secretary General has articulated in his reform agenda, we are not evolving fast enough, we are not performing in line with our opportunities, and we are also not taking advantage of some of the possibilities that are now before us. Now, let me quickly emphasize, this is not saying to you there is a failure and that therefore the system is only one of underperformance. I will also, in the course of my presentation to you today, try to invite all of you to reflect for a moment on some of the metrics that are being applied to judge the effectiveness and also the efficiency of the United Nations Development Programme in delivering on its mandate. Because sometimes I think in critiquing where we are not doing enough or not doing well enough, we tend to overlook some of the extraordinary things that are being delivered, also at an extraordinary value for money. But we have to have both conversations, not only focus on the failures or on the shortcomings, or only try to say things are being done that are important and valuable. These two discussions belong together, particularly in an executive board where I view your responsibility and my responsibility as the chief executive, so to speak, of UNDP as a shared task. We are not on opposite sides of the table, although we are accountable to you. But at the end of the day, I look to you also as the custodians of the idea, the mandate, and the role of the United Nations Development Programme as part of the United Nations Development System. Let me briefly say a few words, and let me also say that I will distribute, or maybe it has been distributed already, my full Executive Board speech to you, and I will not repeat everything verbatim that is written here, because some of it, I think, is in support of your need to have some reference information. I would like to use my address this morning to share with you the approach, the framing, and also the commitment with which I and my senior management team and staff across the world are trying to put to you a vision of UNDP in terms of how it moves forward, and in the context of a 4-year strategic plan to paint on a canvas what is it that we would like UNDP to be 4 years from now, without pretending that we are starting either from zero or that everything will be different. This organization is an organization that is delivering in over 170 countries right now. It has a portfolio of billions of dollars of projects and funding commitments, and it also has 17,000 people working across the world delivering on this mandate. But I take the strategic plan as an opportunity to learn lessons, to set pathways for change, to agree with you on what are the strategic priorities to guide this organization, and above all, to make UNDP a central backbone to the UN's development offering in the years to come. In the informals, we have already made good progress, and I would like to thank all of you who have been providing us and our team with feedback in the drafting of the strategic plan. We are making rapid progress. We hope to have the first full written draft with you by the middle of the month. It's going to be a forward-looking document indeed. It's going to have some framing propositions that I hope will better capture some of the comments that you have made over the last year as we have produced the initial drafts. And it will also address, if you want, some of the underlying questions that have been simmering away in discussions among you as member states. The frame of reference is, without doubt, the QCPR, and through the QCPR, Agenda 2030 and the SDGs. It is our departure point. But we have drawn on the comments that you have made over the last few months. We have drawn on the independent evaluation of the current strategic plan, and also the joint assessment of the Independent Evaluation Office and the Office for Audit Investigations on institutional effectiveness. We have taken the comments from member states on board in many conversations through our resident coordinators, our country teams, and also our directors in headquarters. And we have obviously engaged with the Secretary General, the Deputy Secretary General, in the context of their reform agenda, and trying to appreciate both the critique, some of the shortcomings, but at the same time the centrality that they accord and attribute to UNDP in the future evolution of the UN development system. UNDP must respond to this guidance, this evaluation evidence, but also the strategic directions and the opportunities that relate also to some of the contexts that I described at the beginning in a very dynamic way. The world is more complex. Issues are more interrelated. That is one of the fundamental hypotheses also underlying Agenda 2030 and the SDGs. It means that we in UNDP must also evolve our offering to the world. We must be responsive to national contexts. We must be adaptive to particular settings, but we must also be able to draw on the best in terms of knowledge, expertise, and practices across the world. And that is why I keep on saying also that, to me, South-South cooperation is not only central, it is integral to the future offering of UNDP. Alongside North-South cooperation, cooperation between civil society organizations and governments and the private sector. The future of development, choices, and informed decision-making relies on the best expertise, irrespective of where it comes from. But through the work that we do in UNDP, hopefully qualitatively excellent, validated, legitimate, and also tried and tested. Because many of the propositions that are now on the table of governments in setting the public policy and regulatory frameworks will have far-reaching consequences in terms of the financial system, the compact between aging and young populations, between the rural and the urban economy. That is what the SDGs have put at the forefront of the development agenda, and it is only right that UNDP should embrace that concept of, yes, we are managing complexity, we must get systems approaches right, because the choice today is no longer between investing in rural or urban economies or into higher education or secondary education or into access to energy versus health. Our societies have time and again said they expect more from their governments and also from their leaders. That is why, in trying to present to you an approach for our future work, we have focused on multidimensional responses. We have continued to put the emphasis on poverty, the poor and the most marginalized, and we have also put great emphasis on understanding our own key strengths and competencies in terms of presence, global knowledge, in terms of the trust we enjoy, but also, and I will repeat this a number of times today, the fact that we belong to a United Nations system, that we are central to a United Nations development system, and therefore UNDP is not only a program, it is also the UN's development partnership, which must be part of putting into value, or as we say in French, mise en valeur, the logic of having UNDP be part of this orchestra of capacities and competencies. And we must reflect the 21st century global development landscape in terms of the challenges, the opportunities, the transitions. I have time and again over the last few months been told by many government representatives, civil society actors, think tanks, we need UNDP to rediscover its role as a thought leader in development. Now, each one may project different ideas into this concept of thought leadership, but it does speak to the important reference role that UNDP can play also in the global landscape. Let me just emphasize once more also the importance of interpreting leaving no one behind and the importance of poverty eradication in the strategic plan. First of all, many of you will know that in the current core funding of UNDP, over 85% of its resources are in fact directed towards least developed countries. So in terms of an indicator, I think the institution is pegging itself precisely in line with what you have asked it to do. And we also need to recognize that poverty eradication in terms of extreme poverty rates over the last 23 years has been extraordinary, where 35% was the actual rate in 1990 of people living in extreme poverty. It has now been brought down to just over 11%, and we have moved over 1 billion people out of extreme poverty in this period. And I say we because this is not something that UNDP or the UN system can claim credit for. In fact, it is countries who have acted. But let us not forget how important the UN has been as a forum for putting poverty on the radar of the international community, of aid financing, but also of national policy making, and not least through the Millennium Development Goals and now the SDGs. But what we have also learned is that many of the poorest people, those that we have pledged to not leave behind, do not necessarily in numbers live in least developed countries. They also happen to live in middle-income countries, and perhaps more disconcertingly, more and more of those left behind are also living in countries that we traditionally refer to as OECD or developed nations. And we have also learned that a risk is becoming ever more clearer, that poverty eradication is just the first step. Unfortunately, we have had to learn, alongside those who suffered this fate, a bitter lesson, that many of those who have managed to escape extreme poverty are also the most vulnerable to immediately fall back into it. And therefore, there are lessons to be learned here in the way that we deploy our work. But I want to close the circle again to where I began my presentation, which is also on the notion of inequality. Poverty is an absolute reality, and poverty is also a phenomenon that can tear societies apart through the perception of inequality and unfairness. Our strategic plan embraces this challenge and embraces it in its totality. That's why we have, based on the Agenda 2030 and SDG centrality to our work, suggested 2 core offers in the future to structure our work and offering. One, a country-level SDG support platform, and secondly, a global development and advisory implementation services platform. And let me emphasize, because in the informals, sometimes the term platform suggested an exclusive domain. It is the opposite we are suggesting. In using the term platform, we want to demonstrate that UNDP has an enormously important role in the UN as a platform, first of all, for countries to access advice, support, finance, but also for the UN family to deploy its services at country level in partnership by utilizing some of the infrastructure that UNDP has, and ultimately by taking advantage of our capacity to deliver collectively and jointly. Certainly UNDP's almost unmatched presence at country level is a major asset, and it is one that I believe the UN system is using actually every day, even though we more often hear about instances where perhaps the competition or the lack of coordination, joint planning have become issues. In the strategic plan, from these 2 core offerings, we also suggest to you that there are perhaps, or there is a new way of capturing this continued conversation amongst you as member states of where UNDP should work and on what terms it should work with countries. We are suggesting to you that it is appropriate in the context of Agenda 2030 and the SDGs to work across 3 developmental settings, if I may refer to them. And again, the terminology is still one that we are working on, but essentially they are focused around countries that are still principally addressing poverty eradication, multidimensional in its nature and developmental in its view, but certainly central to our engagement with them. A second grouping of countries that are in a more transitional, transformational phase of their economies, whether in terms of rural, urban, infrastructure, energy systems, and national development priorities, and therefore looking to UNDP also for advice. But here, as they will more often than not be middle-income countries, UNDP also evolving terms of engagement that is more appropriate to the current developmental setting. And a third group of countries that are those affected by crisis, emerging from crisis, whether through natural disasters or conflict, where the central purpose and objective of the engagement of the international community, but also of national authorities, in my interpretation, cannot be anything else but to return a country to its development pathway, to the equilibrium where conflict or natural disasters are no longer distracting and detracting from a national development process, but in fact allow countries to recover as quickly as possible in order to invest in their future rather than just coping with disaster. Alongside this concept, we are also putting forward to you the notion of signature development solutions. What we're trying to capture here is the need to also be explicit about where UNDP would, in terms of its genuine and singular contribution, be accountable for making transformational services available to countries that are also scalable in terms of their impact and measurable in terms of their impact and contribution to the SDGs. Please don't take the number I will give you right now as necessarily mathematically correct, but what we are trying to do here is to focus your attention in terms of our accountability and measurement of impact and effectiveness on the 80% of what truly is core offering and services of UNDP, and where the institution needs to be measured by you, by countries, by those who fund us, as opposed to the 20% of activities where we are responsive to many different contexts, which all of you over time have always asked UNDP to be. But sometimes at the level of an executive board, we find ourselves in a discussion where the very strength that you as individual countries attribute to this organization, namely our ability to be there when you need us to respond at the very moment of greatest need, is turned in our discussions in the executive board into a kind of latent weakness of the organization. I do not have a clear answer to that, but I want to challenge us all inside my team, but also with you as the executive board, that we have to find a more intelligent way of addressing this issue. Because clearly UNDP's strength is to be able to deliver across a broad spectrum of needs. Its weaknesses sometimes has been not to be able to explain this or to also demonstrate what proportion of our portfolio falls into that category. And yes, we have also at times failed to make the most of being part of a UN system in delivering to these responses, because being the first responder, in inverted commas, does not mean that the agency or fund or program in the United Nations that is actually tasked with this subject should not be either from the beginning or over time an integral partner in delivering that support. But I would suggest to you, that has been the request to our strategic planning team, that these signature development solutions should capture between 60 to 80% of what it is that UNDP delivers. Because on this, we must be transparent, results-based, measurable, and accountable in a way that assures you that the vast majority of what this institution does is highly effective, is targeted, and is responsive to the mandate and the agenda set for us. While some of the other things we simply cannot plan for. We do not know when an earthquake happens. We do not know when ethnic conflict breaks out, at least not a year or two in advance to plan for it. We also cannot predict in terms of place and date when the next drought or the next flood will occur, even though we know that more and more of them will occur. These are the kinds of discussions and also analyses that are informing our strategic plan. You will see also in my report to you and in the discussions we have had with you that we are also working on a new business model. The idea here is not to emulate the private sector in terms of profit loss, but it is to say that an institution that has a $5 billion turnover, roughly at the moment, works in 170 countries, deploys 8,500 plus another 8,000 service contracts in terms of staff across the world, provides services, for instance, to other UN agencies in HR terms alone of over $500 million in the UN system, clearly must ask itself whether its current income and expenditure model is viable. And my simple answer to you is, in the long term, this organization's business model is not viable. We already know that our cost recovery in some respects is inadequate. We, together with your permission over the last few years as part of some of the management reforms undertaken, have already been drawing on some of our reserves, which was a legitimate and strategic investment. But this cannot be a long-term trend. We also have to recognize that this institution is at the receiving end of at least a worrying vote by our clients in the group of donors. Core funding has been declining in UNDP, both in absolute and relative terms, for years. You are voting with your checkbooks, and this is a message that we must take seriously. Now, there may be a political debate amongst you as member states, but it is also my experience that institutions will attract funding if they are delivering around a set of consensus priorities. I would be surprised if UNDP cannot formulate to all of you a set of compelling priorities around which both those who enable our work to happen through funding, and let us be honest, this institution largely depends on a group of less than 12 countries in a world of 193 member states of the United Nations for the vast majority of its financing. This in itself cannot be a viable long-term proposition. We also face, through the evaluations and many other feedbacks that we have received, not least from our country teams, the staff who are on the front line of delivering our services every day, essentially complain about an administrative system that is complex, too slow, that is focused on compliance and risk avoidance. And therefore, one of my pleas to the team that I have put in place to look at the business model, not only in terms of numbers, but also in strategy and strategic management terms, is that this organization that is committed to working in some of the most disrupted and crisis-challenged contexts cannot pretend to have risk avoidance as its number one principle in administrative and fiduciary terms. Why else would we then work in many of the countries we do? Our challenge is to manage risks, and we need your confidence and trust as board members to accept that, yes, if we work in a post-conflict setting, where government institutions may be absent, where receipts may not even exist in the market for services that we purchase, that there will, one, be challenges, sometimes in terms of fiduciary or managerial accountability, and yes, we will sometimes also face failures in terms of avoiding corruption and mismanagement. I want to be absolutely clear. We have a policy of zero tolerance, but that's easily said. The question is, how do we empower those we send to manage our programs into a setting where zero tolerance is the privilege of a chief executive to articulate, but it is actually impossible to work on that principle if you're trying to deliver aid in a place where you're trying to purchase services, as I described, in a setting that is simply not comparable to a normal situation. We sometimes will need also your support, because the media loves, and rightly so, to look at an institution in terms of its failures. As we speak to the world about the work that we do, we should not hide our failures. We should actually not be afraid of saying that here and here and here we have had problems. But we found them and we acted on them, but they are part of doing business in the world that we are asked to work in. It's a difficult conversation to have, but it's one that I hope we can have with you as the executive board, rather than being seen to be defensive or even trying to hide these issues from you. Indeed, our Office of Internal Audit and Investigations is, in my mind, one of the best risk insurance tools that we have, if we are able to confront some of its findings, not by running away from them, but by saying, what lessons do we learn? How can we reduce this even further? And above all, not expect those people that we ask to manage our programs in highly risky settings to pretend that we are working without risks. And that's why, beyond some of these issues, I will, over the next 6 to 12 months, complete a cycle of a systematic review of the business model. And in part, it is already signaled into what we have suggested in the strategic plan. But as I think you will understand, this is not work you can do in just a few weeks. This has a lot to do with business processes, with understanding also where we can move to a paradigm of risk management while actually ensuring that the integrity of the organization is even more assured in the future. Finally, the strategic plan carries within it a continued and repetitive message. This is a program whose success, both in the past but even more so in the future, is premised on the notion of partnerships. The Secretary General's vision of the UN Development System has UNDP as an integrator platform, as a backbone, as a central service provider to a collective offering that the UN Development System can deliver to countries and to international development thinking. We must evolve our own system in UNDP. We must also face the challenge of how we deal with funding and fundraising and the financing of our work in the years to come. Because what I currently, and you're all familiar with this, see time and again is that we are almost forced to compete with our sister agencies in order to maintain what are considered some of the principal assets of this organization. This is one of the discontinuities in the business model of UNDP in the year 2017, and I commit to you not to be able to solve them in one fell swoop, but to make them a central part of the next 4 years of delivering to you a UNDP in the year 2021 that will be more transparent and strategic in terms of the delivery that it can provide to Agenda 2030 and the SDGs, that is clear about how it serves different groupings of countries, that is based on a business model that is viable and also fair and equitable and transparent, and that above all recognizes that UNDP's greatest value added is when it can make the value of the UN development system come to fruition. A few concluding remarks, if you allow me, on the funding situation of 2016. Again, my paper provides you with the latest figures, and the good news that I can share with you is that the year 2016 in overall contributions received was a good year. Our total receipts were around $4.9 billion, an 8% increase over the year 2015. So I would like to thank you, the donor countries, but also many non-OECD countries who actually are part of making up this sum. And I again want to draw your attention in the discussions tomorrow that there are far more countries contributing to the income that UNDP has at its disposal to do its work than is often appreciated. Countries that are not amongst the traditional donor nations. The bad news is that in 2016 we also saw the continued decline of core yet again taking place. We have a 12% decrease in core funding to UNDP to a level of $618 million. And I'm afraid that the figures that I have received and inherited for the year 2017 unfortunately seem to further validate this trend, and that our expected core financing or funding for the year 2017 is likely to be in the range of $600 million. Clearly, as I already alluded to, these are trends that must make us worried. They are trend lines that are not sustainable, and they point to a compact in whichever form, whether as part of the larger UN development system or specifically around the mandate of UNDP, that we need to develop for the years ahead. This institution is too important to too many countries and to too many agendas to allow it to, in a sense, be eroded in terms of mandate, impact, scale, and capacity to serve by this silent undermining of its ability to operate. The IRD highlights key objectives, and again, I would advise you to look at page 10 of my speech, where I outline some of the key drivers and criteria. In essence, what we are projecting for the 4 years that lie ahead of us in the strategic plan is a total contribution or financial level of $23.9 billion over the 4-year period. And before you wonder whether we are being hyper-optimistic, don't worry. These 24.9 billion do include $3 billion in terms of funds that are being brought forward from the current biennium. And again, here we are putting a lot of emphasis on managing the implementation of these balances. The projection is based on historical trends, and therefore I take it as a set of assumptions that are valid in principle, even though they may still evolve as a result of further developments. The integrated budget may also include a provision for strategic investments that will be presented to you tomorrow. And I hope that we can, after ACABQ review and further work with you as the Executive Board in consultation with you, submit the integrated budget for a board approval in November. The paper that I present to you also makes a distinction between funding and financing. Funding of UNDP and financing for sustainable development. We have found in many of the reviews and also discussions with member states and our sister agencies that the Agenda 2030 SDG implementation strategy is fundamentally dependent on answering the question of financing. It is not only since Addis that we know this, but the Addis agenda has put further focus and priority on the UN system to address this issue. As you know, the Secretary General and the Deputy Secretary General are leading a process of thinking about how the UN as a system can better respond to this. And certainly in our work as the UN Development Programme, I envisage that while we have a challenge in-house, so to speak, of addressing our own funding, we also have an extraordinary opportunity to work alongside national governments in addressing the issue of financing for development, from the ODA perspective through the public budgets, the fiscal policies, but ultimately, let us also be honest, in the greatest hope we have for SDG implementation, that is financing beyond public and government budgets. In most of our economies, public budgets account for less than a fifth of total financial investments and transactions. It is therefore essential that we create the conditions, that we align the investment opportunities for implementing Agenda 2030 and the SDGs with a world that is often interested in contributing, but has largely viewed itself as not responsible for aligning how a financial system or market works in also supporting national development goals. This is a key task, and I think development thinking, development policy making, the regulatory framework is in part also an attempt to de-risk through development investments the economy and therefore make it more compatible with mobilizing these resources. It is an area in which I believe UNDP, together with sister agencies, but also the Bretton Woods system, regional development banks, and many other partners, can play an increasingly important role. And finally, with UNDP, let me also emphasize that in my report to you, I spend a significant part of time also recounting some of the work we have done, particularly in crisis contexts. UNDP has this dual opportunity of serving countries sometimes at the most extreme moments in their history, while also working on supporting global agendas. I have recounted to you how we are making Agenda 2030 and the SDGs a central part of the next 4 years in driving UNDP's and guiding UNDP's work, not least because 114 countries have already requested UN country teams for support in implementing it. We have deployed teams in terms of the MAPS missions to assist on national implementation. We worked with over 29 countries in preparing their voluntary national reports to the HLPF, and the numbers go on and on. We are already deeply engaged with many countries in that arena. The Paris Agreement is another example. Global agreement, but actually implementation at the national level. How do NDCs now translate and influence national development thinking, investment choices, infrastructure choices? How do we combine the objective of access to energy with clean energy pathways? Can the low-carbon economy be more than a global set of objectives, but actually become a driver of innovative and future-oriented infrastructure and development investment choices at national level? Our work here, together with the Secretary General, the UNFCCC, but also in partnerships such as UN-RED that we are co-implementers of with FAO and UNEP and UNDP, are good examples. Unbeknownst to many, UNDP is one of the major implementing entities for climate finance in terms of public finance in the world today. We have over 140 countries in which we assist and support with the implementation of climate change-related adaptation and mitigation projects to the tune of $2.8 billion that have been funded through the service that UNDP provides. And if you take the leveraged amount, it is actually over $5 billion in climate finance. It's a good example of how we work as part of a global agreement, as part of the UN family, but ultimately actually on the front line of assisting and advising governments of how to implement and access financing for implementing their NDCs. I end by drawing attention to what is in some ways perhaps the most troubling part of our work, but also, as the video tried to illustrate, the most immediately relevant part of our work. And not because it has nothing to do with development, but because in crises, as I emphasized earlier on, our role is to focus on how we can assist countries to return to a development pathway out of crisis. That must be what informs our engagement. It is how we also have to work like teeth wheels with our humanitarian sister agencies. But our involvement, our presence, and our focus is centered around the notion of a country being able to look at its future development pathway. Right now, the SDGs call to action on famine in South Sudan, Somalia, northeastern Nigeria, and Yemen has become a key part also of my work and role. I co-chair a committee here, and I have also, in the last few weeks, been troubled on the one hand by our inability in some respects to be able to act on a scale that is called for, but at the same time troubled by the fact that sometimes when we succeed, it is non-news. Remember, just a few months ago, we had anticipated that in some of the countries I just cited, of these 4, we could have massive famine. It actually hasn't happened. Now, let me not in any way diminish the stress under which communities and people are finding themselves right now. But because, and we have to speak to this, because the United Nations, the Secretary General, our humanitarian agencies, and national governments, and NGOs spoke up 5-6 months ago and warned about this extraordinary famine that was unfolding. And because we were able to mobilize this response, we are able to look each other in the eye here today and say, maybe, just maybe, in some of these countries this time, we actually avoided the worst. But would anybody out there in the world know the consequence of having acted a few months back on these urgent calls by the Secretary General and the leaders of OCHA and WFP and UNICEF? I don't think they will probably ever know. We need to ask ourselves also in the executive board and in management of UNDP and the UN system, what it is that we are not getting right, that we cannot speak to some of the successes or at least the avoidance of the worst possible scenario that we have contributed to. Right now, UNDP is engaged not only in the 4 countries I mentioned to you right now in extensive ways, but in the Central African Republic, in a number of Arab states that are affected by the crisis in the region: Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Libya. We are also working and cooperating at the request of a number of governments on addressing issues that have to do with the emergence of violent extremism, essentially on the back of a failure of development processes. A failure of development that ultimately creates the conditions under which violent extremism, radicalization, and disenchantment by that youth generation that I alluded to at the beginning emerges. We are learning lessons right now in how we can best contribute to national efforts in addressing this, and among them Jordan, the Kingdom of Morocco, Egypt, Somalia, and Sudan are some. Mr. President, members of the Executive Board, let me end right here by saying to you, I consider it an extraordinary privilege to have been appointed the administrator of UNDP. I consider it a privilege because I think our understanding of how central development is, not only to national interest, to poverty eradication, to leaving no one behind, but actually to our ability to work together, to succeed and to thrive in a world that is so inextricably interdependent, has everything to do with development. It has everything to do with the choices that we make at national level based on good advice and best practice. It has also everything to do with understanding that investing, for instance, in access to energy and clean energy on a continent such as Africa, which today has 600 million people without access to electricity. 600 million people, and in the world as a whole, over 1 billion people, still do not, in the 21st century, of sending people to the moon, of artificial intelligence, of technology, automation, robots, and everything else, have access to electricity. To consider that to be an issue of charity or in some other form a donation, rather than understanding that investing in Africa's ability to rapidly bring these 600 million people into a either national grid or off-grid electricity generating infrastructure is not charity. It is, yes, solidarity, and it is above all recognizing that in investing in one another, we are investing in our common future. And I think sometimes it bears to remind ourselves that that was the idea that led to the establishment of the United Nations Development Programme, and why even in the year 2017, it is not only still around, it is actually the backbone of the UN's promise to be part of addressing inequality, unsustainability, against an objective and an aspiration of development for all, wherever they may be on this planet. Thank you very much.